cultivators of curiosity, and welcome to the NAPB Breeding Bites podcast. I'm your host today, Lance Meyer. And today we'll guide you through the captivating universe where seeds, genes, and everything in between converge. Whether you're out in the field, orchestrating a symphony of pollen in the nursery, or decoding the secrets in the genetics lab, you've just stepped into the epicenter of scientific discovery. In today's episode, we have Donn Cummings to talk about a successful career as a plant breeder and his involvement in NAPB and the Borlaug Scholars. So buckle up and join us as we cultivate some captivating conversations.
Well, thank you, Lance, and thank you to the group for inviting me to be a part of this. I think it's excellent. The Education Committee does great things, and this is one of the new innovations, and I appreciate being invited to be one of an elite set of plant breeders that I have worked with a lot, all of them, and enjoy very much those relationships. So I started out in Indiana, grew up in a rural farming community. I didn't live on the farm, but all of my relatives were farmers, and I spent a lot of time on farms growing up. My dad worked for Farm Bureau Co-op and in more of a financial accounting side of the business of farming, but very much agriculture in my blood. Went to Purdue, got a BS and a MS degree. In my MS was in plant breeding and genetics, but I actually started out as a chemistry major. I had a high school chemistry teacher that was very influential and taught through experiential learning. And I was amazed at how involved chemistry was in biology. I loved critters, and I ended up being so interested that I started as a chem major, but after one semester of boring chemistry formulas written in chalk on a blackboard with an audience of 500 freshmen, it didn't seem the same. And so I switched back to a biology degree. Through that, I got introduced to genetics, which was a fast-moving science at the time, kind of a cutting edge of where things were going. I was invited by Wayne Keim, a professor, to do a master's degree and have a teaching assistantship, envisioning that I might someday be a teacher or maybe even a professor like him. From there, I got introduced to doing research. I got on the sorghum project with Dr. John Axtell, with the World Collection of Sorghum and seeing all the variety in the plants of one species. It was exciting to think about what all of that meant, and he was very engaged globally, traveling to India and Africa and so forth. So I got a taste of what global agriculture was about and how important crops could be to other nations and other parts of the world. And through that, I got interested in researching nutritional quality. Purdue was a leader in the lysine enhancement of corn at the time, and that was also being applied to sorghum, but also the tannins in the sorghum plant were important for nutrition, and I did part of my master's thesis on that. Through that experience, I really got interested in the application of genetics and seeing how that could improve the value of plants to people all over the world and how new varieties could really affect society. So I went to Minnesota on Dr. Axtell and Dr. Keim's and others' recommendation and started a PhD program in oats for one thing, and that was supported by Quaker Oats. And my thesis included chapters on tissue culture, nutritional quality, and plant breeding aspects, which made it a quite diverse and solid educational platform to build on. After that, I went into the seed industry. I was recruited into the seed industry when Pfizer bought Trojan Seed Company, a Minnesota company, family owned, that started Pfizer's entry into seed. And that evolved into Pfizer Genetics, and then DeKalb Genetics, DeKalb Pfizer Genetics, and then DeKalb Genetics, and Monsanto bought DeKalb Genetics. So even though I was a corn breeder for many years, not really changing locations or jobs that much, different titles, different companies paying my salary, I was a corn breeder in Indiana and developed a lot of inbreds and hybrids in that capacity and had commercial success. And after about 30 years of that, I was given a fork in the road to choose between continuing to breed corn or working as global breeder sourcing lead, a new position that was created at that time in about 2007. And I chose that path. And that path was one of networking and relationships involving talent coming into plant breeding and trying to encourage graduate students that were emerging plant breeders to understand the opportunities that existed in industry and how they could engage in those opportunities and become a part of it. We recruited a lot of graduate students, and we doubled the number of plant breeding graduate students in the US at the time through contributions from Monsanto to grants to students. And I was managing a lot of that grant process for 7 years. Then I retired, and since then I have worked a lot on mentoring relationships and networking, continuing to leverage the networking opportunities and the plant breeding career in terms of where I apply those skills, and working across organizations like ASTA, the Tri-Societies, and others that are interested in plant breeding. So that's kind of it, Lance. That's who I am.
Well, thanks, Don. You had an amazing career and you had a huge impact on a lot of students, including myself. You know, there's a lot of things I want to ask you, but off the bat, you know, I think this is something a lot of students ask for. Is you did a very similar thing that I did as well. You went from a small grains PhD, right, into corn. Also go as a corn breeder in Indiana myself. You know, I made that very similar transition. How did you think you were able to handle that? And you know, I think a lot of students think that maybe you kind of pigeonhole yourself to the crop that you study in, but that's not the case, right? So what is your kind of thoughts on being able to
Well, mine was interesting, Lance, because I did have a quarter-time assistantship in the corn project while at Minnesota. So I actually worked on corn as a graduate student. I had a half-time assistantship through Quaker Oats on the oat project, but I also had a quarter time on the corn project. I had a first child at the end of my master's degree, so I had a family to support, and the University of Minnesota was gracious enough at that time to put together a departmental quarter-time assistantship. And so I worked on both projects. I would go out and shoot bag corn all morning, and when it got hot enough at noon, I would switch over and harvest the oat plots. And so it was quite a broad education in cross and self-pollinated species, and sorghum, being somewhat of an in-betweener in a way, was another strong crop to have worked with. Tissue culture was new at the time, and there was a lot of genetic innovation. So combining all of that, I think, gave me a very broad base and interest for finding my first job. There were not a lot of jobs available when I got out. It was difficult to choose. I looked at and was offered a USDA job, an academic job, and an industry job. And among those, I chose the industry job. It was a little closer to my family roots in Indiana. And I felt fairly incompetent as a corn breeder. I was humbled during my prelims by asking, what's the price of corn today? And I had no idea. And they said, well, how are you going to breed corn if you don't know the value of it? And how do you develop a selection index that involves the value of your crop? And I could not answer the question. I couldn't give a dollar per bushel answer, which was a fairly specific, easy question. That was kind of a softball question, and I failed it miserably, but I passed the prelims and quickly learned that you need to pay attention to a lot of things when you become a plant breeder.
Do you know what corn's at right now?
No, I don't. But that's your problem, not mine now.
Yeah, it's low. It's low, what it has been, but yeah.
Well, it was about 250 a bushel for most of my career. It went up and down, but it was that's about where it was at for a long, long time.
Yeah, it's getting around that $4 a bushel right now. It's getting low, but yeah, we can move on from corn.
Yeah.
So you said you did a lot of student interaction as you moved on from a corn breeder into your other role within Monsanto at the time, correct?
Yes.
Was that the Monsanto Fellows that is that the program they supported students on?
Yes, there was a fellows program that was global that I also helped do the selection process in for Ted Crosby, and
Okay.
supported him in that. That was different. So I called it the Monsanto Fellows in Plant Breeding Program because I wanted to distinguish it from the global program. And this program was a professional development program where we supported through funding the research that was being done for PhD projects. And actually, the university selected the students for the program, but it was funded largely by Monsanto, and I was the person that was in charge of handling the relationships between the universities and the company. And we were creating individually impactful programs where we actually paired up students that were studying plant breeding with some of our plant breeders, and they spent weeks immersed in the Monsanto program, seeing all of the proprietary software and ways of doing things. And so it was a unique time in history. We really impacted the academic programs by adding students, which secured, I think, some professorships and maintained nursery land and farmland that was otherwise getting put into university buildings. So I think it was a very impactful program at a key time, and it was really something that was done to turn the corner on a declining profession in a way. There were over 300 companies breeding corn in the US at the time. That consolidated down to a handful.
Yeah.
And in the process, there were a lot of grassroots, self-trained or on-the-job trained plant breeders that were doing a lot of crossing and selecting and testing of hybrids and inbreds. That evolved into a small number of companies with large research departments doing most of the genetic improvement work. So in that process, there were a lot of plant breeders losing jobs. There were a lot of, and we experienced almost a decade of a shortage of training new plant breeders. And I think this role and Monsanto's commitment to it actually jump-started plant breeding again. And
Wow.
I would credit Ted Crosby for a lot of the vision, and Rob Fraley for doing that. In that role, Lance, we hired about 100 breeders in 7 years. Not all breeders, 100 scientists, I should say, breeding related.
Okay.
A lot of genetics and other sciences that were around breeding. And that was almost one a month. So really impactful in the talent pipeline process.
So would that have been around the same time as biotech would have taken off? Is that kind of the same timeline?
Yeah, biotech really took off in response to a number of things, but one was being able to patent plants
Okay.
in 1980, which enabled a lot of research to be invested in. And that's why Pfizer was investing in the seed company. They felt like they knew something about genetics, and they had the animal pharmaceutical business on farms. They thought they knew something about agriculture, but the seed business is very different.
Yeah.
And yet that was the outlet for the science, the emerging science, the vehicle to deliver that to the marketplace and get the return on investment was seed. And so companies like Pfizer needed to invest in seed, even though that was not their expertise, but that was the vehicle to the market. So yeah, we saw a lot of biotech investment. The mid to late 90s was when things like marker-aided breeding came along, and transformation of plants started to have an impact, and we started to see the commercialization of traits that were totally disruptive to the industry. Traits like BT corn and Roundup Ready corn. I was involved in growing some of the first BT corn and Roundup Ready corn in Indiana when it was released from the lab to the field. It was a real challenge because there was a lot of regulation around that, and there were really the rules were being developed as it occurred. And we were site responsible researchers, so we had to do all the paperwork and dot all the I's and cross all the T's to make sure that nothing bad happened. There were incidents of things happening that affected $1 million impacts, which were negative. And so some companies had some real challenges around that area, but I think we were pretty good in those releases. And for me, it was life-changing to see that the technology really worked. We were putting a lot of live egg masses from entomology labs that were shipped to us on plants and evaluating them in the field for corn borer. And we were making slow or no progress, it seemed, in selecting the resistance. And then all of a sudden, here's BT, and it's almost immune. The same thing with herbicide resistance with Roundup Ready. We were spraying Roundup around our nursery to kill weeds, but it was such a general green plant killer that corn just got a whiff of it and it would die instantly. And to grow that in the field side by side, the Roundup Ready resistant and the traditional corn, and spray it with Roundup and watch one die in a few days and the other one just continued to grow normally, was obvious that this was going to be life-changing technology, and it proved out to be so. It really changed the chemistry in the industry in particular, was totally changed by Roundup. And it was due to the resistance and the combination of the herbicide.
I mean, it's amazing to think that, plant breeders my generation, I've never really been around other than, the a little bit of conventional material out there. Vast majority of stuff's biotech, right? For at least for
Right.
soy in the US. And so it's really amazing to hear stories from you, I've talked to like Dave Bubeck about it, and it's really interesting to hear, how big of an impact that had. I even think about hearing stories from my grandpa on our family farm, like how big of an impact, it really had, and we take it for granted.
It was amazing to live through, and the technology at the time, tissue culture was relatively new in plants. Uh, University of Minnesota was able to regenerate corn plants from callus. And when I got there, they had just completed some of those publications, and I started working on it in oats, and was able to regenerate whole plants in oats for the first time and publish that as a chapter of my thesis. That experience led to, when I was hired by industry, being a liaison with Pfizer's small group of plant scientists at the time, one of whom was able to do something really remarkable. And that was to regenerate whole plants of B73 from callus, which was the most important inbred in the industry and was a trade secret at the time. And I was able to grow the first seeds in Indiana of regenerated B73 from their program and look at somoclonal variation, and reported on that in Las Vegas at the ASA meetings. And that was shortly after I graduated with my PhD. And that was another innovation that I felt pretty special about, being the first to see in the field as a plant breeder, and seeing how close it was getting to commercial impact. So it's exciting to see these new technologies emerge and think about how they may change and impact society going forward.
Yeah, wow. That's pretty impressive. You got to work on some of that. So
You never know what you're going to run into in plant breeding. It's so inclusive, and anything that helps the farmer and helps us produce more with less has been the way to go. Borlaug's impact really was tremendous in wheat, but at the same time in Mexico, they were working on corn and beans and other crops, and it was a much bigger effort than Borlaug's breeding program. I think it's interesting, and maybe the audience will find this interesting, that Borlaug was not trained as a plant breeder.
yeah,
He was trained as a pathologist and as a forestry major, and he learned his genetics through that, a lot of rust genetics. But he was recruited by his pathologist mentor to do the work in Mexico. E.C. Stakeman was his major professor, and recruited him after he went to industry for a couple years in Delaware with DuPont. He was recruited to go to Mexico in 1944 to work on this wheat project. Amazingly successful there, but he now is recognized as one of our heroes in the plant breeding world, and we named the Borlaug Scholars after him and his legacy, but he was actually not trained as a plant breeder.
yeah. I mean, yeah, he's had a huge impact. And now that you brought that up, I'd actually like to maybe dig into that. Uh, you have a huge impact on Borlaug Scholars. I know that's where I met you first. And then you also met Borlaug too, right? And had interactions with him. Is that correct? And then so before we get into that, I'd like to maybe talk about that. I hope the audience caught it, but you're retired, right? And you still have such a passion for interacting with plant breeders and students that you're still heavily involved, right? And therefore I would kind of want to hear your take on how your involvement in NAPB has been over the years, and just your general interaction with NAPB and Borlaug scholars.
Well, it's really been fun, Lance, growing up with NAPB, because NAPB came into existence. And if I give you a little of the history, I think a number of the audience will find that interesting. There was a conference at Michigan State University in 2005. Some of my colleagues from Monsanto were there. A number of public breeders and government breeders, and the combination of them trying to work together for the future of plant breeding resulted there was a committee formed, the Plant Breeding Coordinating Committee, which was a governmental committee that was focused on plant breeding. And out of that conference, there was some work done in the 2006-07 timeframe that led to a gathering in Raleigh, North Carolina in 2007 to plot the future of what ended up becoming an NAPB, but it was really the developing an annual meeting, and PBCC was coordinating the annual meeting for the first few years. Monsanto was the 2008 annual meeting in Iowa. And so they were a leader in this whole process. And I was in a position at just started and an opportunity to really engage in this whole process. One of my friends at the time was at that Michigan conference and was in a small committee that was starting within Monsanto to work on academic institution relations and this whole process. And he got reassigned to go to Europe for a Europe Africa stint of leading that. And he asked me if I would like to take on that volunteer committee work. And so I said, sure, I'll participate in that. And so I was doing that while I was a plant breeder, and I was doing it from Indiana, not St. Louis. And it was fun. I enjoyed it, and it was working out. And then at a breeder meeting in St. Louis, one of the HR people came to me, and we sat down, and he turned a napkin over on the table and said, now tell me again what you've been doing in this committee. And basically that became my job description for the global breeder sourcing lead role. And it was unique, it was innovative, and so I had to choose whether I was going to make that my full-time job or whether I was going to continue breeding and somebody else could take that on. And I think that my passion for it was that it was around breeding, and Borlaug had inspired that passion in me to make sure we had the next generation. And this was a chance to really express that in a new way. And I had had quite a bit of success in inbred and hybrid commercialization. So I had a legacy in germplasm, and I decided that it was time that I would move in a different direction. And it was one of the best decisions that I made, because it was a very rewarding finish to my career, and opened so many doors that I've been walking through in my retirement years, as you mentioned.
Yeah, because you're still involved with an NAPB, but also you said you're involved with ASTA as well, right?
Right. Well, I was involved with the strategic planning process from the beginning. And so we've done now our third strategic plan is coming out in this coming year. I hope people will come to St. Louis and help as we roll some of that information out. But there's groups working on that now, and having been in that process for a long time and served on many of the committees at NAPB, it's been rewarding. But it was actually volunteer work at the Tri-Societies, where when I retired from Monsanto, I went on to the ASF board at the Tri-Societies and was a board member for 6 years there. And that experience enabled me to see how I could create a scholarship program. And that scholarship program that became the Borlaug Scholars was actually patterned a little bit after the Golden Opportunity Scholars Program in the Tri-Societies, which I was volunteering and mentoring in at the time. And I could see a path forward to create something new. The Golden Opportunity Scholars was only for undergrads, and I wanted to do something that was for grad students, but not leave out undergrads. I wanted to include undergrads as well. So we, in 2018, were able to partner with NAPB leadership to establish a fund through ASF, which was kind of unique because ASF really serves the Tri-Societies primarily. But we were enabled to use some of the capabilities that had been developed in a more sophisticated society over time and leverage that for the benefit of NAPB, a new upstart association. And that has been enormously successful beyond my imagination. Very highly valued program now. We're selecting our next crop, and today happens to be the last day to get your application in. So we are grateful all those applying this year, and will soon be making those selections for the next class of Borlaug Scholars. But yes, through that, I created a booth at the annual meeting for NAPB. Andy Levine from ASTA was at our meeting and saw that and invited me to bring that to the ASTA conventions. And I started taking it to Chicago and the row crop convention, and doing that annually, and then started doing it with the Flower and Veg Show and then the Leadership Summit. And so I've been doing 3 conferences a year with the NAPB booth at ASTA shows, and that has really raised the profile not only of the Borlaug Scholars, but of NAPB across the seed industry.
So for those that maybe aren't aware of the NAPB Borlaug Scholars, can you kind of explain what that is and what are the benefits for students and for mentors as well?
Yes. The students get a free student membership in NAPB. They get a paid registration to attend the annual meeting. They get a paid travel allowance up to $1,500 to travel to the annual meeting. And they get assigned a mentor, either from industry, government, or academia, or an NGO somewhere, that is an experienced plant breeder, that can help mentor them in their stage of life and career growth. And the mentorship has really been one of the more powerful benefits of the program. And it's a benefit not only to the mentees, but also to the mentors. From the beginning, we engaged the executive committee as volunteer mentors as much as we could and as much as they could. And that has been really beneficial. We've had excellent mentors in the program. And I think the mentors would probably agree to a person that it's been extremely valuable to them, keeping them learning about other crops, about other ways of doing things, about other institutions, expanding their knowledge from their mentees, and also giving them the reward of finding talent and sometimes hiring that talent and sometimes connecting them to their institutions, whether that be in a professor role or a field breeding role or other related roles. I think it's been good for the talent flow, and it's been a way of really boosting the mentees in their visibility and their connections. Since we have a whole class now of about 24 Borlaug Scholars a year, that creates a peer group for the mentees to get to know each other and grow together across their careers through that connection, that common experience. And it also provides a cluster of mentees, potential mentees at various stages of life, because they can and do contact mentees other than the one that's assigned to them. And the mentees know each other, and so it's not hard to connect with other mentees in the program. So I think both mentors and mentees just grow enormously through that mentoring relationship.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it did a major impact on my career. My mentor was Dave Bubeck, and he's a mentor of a lot of Borlaug scholars, and a lot of the people I worked at Corteva also were mentees of Dave Bubeck. So he's had a huge impact on not only Corteva but also my career and a lot of my peers. So
And I think it helps a lot in breaking down the walls between different siloed organizations, because you now know people personally across organizational lines and professionally in a very unique way. And I think that connectivity really floats all boats.
absolutely, and like you said, there's room for all types of career space, right? If you're interested in academia, you can have someone from academia, from government. It's really open to all career paths, right?
Well, and I think it does open those doors and allows a bit more mobility across some careers. Some people choose to stay with an organization their entire career. That's less common than it was in my era,
Mhm.
but it's still common, and it's still extremely valuable to organizations to maintain that experience and grow that career. But there are also more opportunities for people to move between organization types and institutions in a way that I think was a little harder to do before. You didn't see too many people going from industry back to academia, but that does occur more. And I do think there's some valuable roles and valuable benefits to that happening more. So that, yes, I think it does help a lot with the fabric of our profession.
Yeah, I mean, and you've had a huge impact on Borlaug scholars. I mean, so you said, were you one of the founders of Borlaug's, and did you get to choose the name Borlaug?
That's a very interesting question, Lance. And uh, while I would have chosen that name gladly, it was actually suggested by Wayne Smith to me,
Okay.
who who was one of the original uh, committee members as well, and helped found it. And Wayne has been tremendous to work with, but he suggested that, and I immediately said that's a great idea. And then after discussing it and deciding that we wanted to move in that direction, I did contact directly Julie Borlaug to see about using the family name. Of course, it's used in many other ways around the world, but his legacy is important to me personally, and so it fit like a glove. And we chose that name, and I couldn't be happier to honor Dr. Borlaug's legacy in the way that that scholarship does. The students compete nationally. They do have to be in the U.S., resident in the U.S. when they apply. They do have to have student status, and they are selected by a committee competing nationally. So it has really a lot of valuable to our profession to identify those students. And then I think another benefit is the George Washington Carver Scholars Program that has paralleled now, and we include them in the breakfast event and so forth at our annual meetings. And that has helped with our diversity and inclusion efforts at NAPB, but it's also part of the peer group that you get exposed to when you become a Borlaug Scholar. So it's all working together, and we're actually thinking about additional ways of expanding mentoring opportunities for both members and mentees.
Yeah. Yeah. Good mention there. That George Washington Carver is a great opportunity as well. You know. Um, so
Great talent coming through that as well.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's open, I think we aim that for more undergrad and earlier students, where the Borlaug Scholar, I feel like more of the selections for Borlaug Scholars tends to be maybe late, like some undergrads, but most like
We try to
later
pick
stage
late stage undergrads in their junior or senior year, and many of which do have some research projects and can present those at the annual meetings. And not all do, and you don't have to. We also get more of the late stage graduate students that are toward the end of their master's or end of their PhD. But it's kind of, the lines are getting fuzzier because we're really looking for the best talent.
So regardless of what stage you're in, apply.
Yeah, I think if you don't get it the first time, reapply too, because it is very competitive, and we're only going to give them to a few institutions, a few at an institution. We're not going to load up on one institution all the time. And we also enjoy institutional support from both industry, but also academic institutions are supporting the scholarship, which I find great. And the government is actually supporting the George Washington Scholars grants through meeting grants. And so it's all working together to bring funding in from many diverse sources that really benefit students. And by benefiting students, we benefit the plant breeding programs around the country that are doing the training and the assurance of that pipeline of talent.
Yeah, I know as a student, a few years ago myself, Borlaug Scholar was like the main thing everyone wanted to talk about and apply to. I know it's a very big honor in our field, especially as students. So
We've had great support with Seed World and others that have added to the visibility for students in that award, that I think has added over time to the prestige of the award.
and I'm glad it honors not only new students but also Borlaug himself. And you've met and interacted with Borlaug before, is that right, Donn?
I met him first in 1976 as a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. There was what Ron Phillips created was the H.K. Hayes Award in honor of a plant breeder at Minnesota that had a legacy. And that award was initiated a couple years, actually, while I was a graduate student at Minnesota. And by the time I had my third year there, I was awarded that honor. And the year that I got it, Dr. Borlaug was invited back to the campus where he got his degrees as an alumnus, to give the keynote lecture. Ron Phillips gave me a book that E.C. Stakeman had written called Campaigns Against Hunger, that described all of the work in Mexico. And he was one of the 3 editors on that book. And it was something that I had to read before I could introduce Dr. Borlaug at the award ceremony. And I also got Dr. Borlaug's rather lengthy resume that included the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. And after reading all of his resume and reading that book and knowing what all was behind his honors and legacy, it really impacted me. And I had dinner with him, and my parents were there. One of my mentors, Wayne Keim, that I mentioned, had become department head of Colorado, and he came to the event. And so it was a very heady event for me as a lowly grad student to participate in. But Dr. Borlaug impressed me because of his great attention to me as a student. He spent his time talking to me. He acknowledged others and but he was very humble and very focused toward the next generation. Uh, that really impacted me, and I had later a chance to be at Summit, in the backyard of Summit, when um, Monsanto helped host a convention there, an international plant breeding convention honoring Dudley, and um, Borlaug was there, and the ambassador from India flew in his helicopter to give the Vespuccian Award, which is the highest award that the country of India gives to any non-Indian citizen. And in the process, his helicopter blew a lot of the pollinating bags off the nursery that the corn breeders at Summit had been putting up all day, so they weren't real happy. But it was a fabulous event, and so I met Borlaug again there, and then I had a chance later on, just before he passed away. I went to Texas A&M for some networking there, and uh, on the way home, I decided to spend an extra day and went to Dallas, and arranged with Julie to go over to Dr. Borlaug's house, spend an evening in his living room for about 3 hours, one-on-one, talking about plant breeding. Was fabulous, talking about how he chose talent and telling him how much impact, his legacy impacted my passion for what I was doing. And I think it's always good if you get a chance to tell mentors and people who have impacted you how it did. And so that was a special moment for me as well.
Well, awesome. That's such a great opportunity that, somebody my age only dreams about, meeting Borlaug. With your long career and, your huge impact on, nowadays students, early career scientists, and even people that are further along in their career now that you've been a mentor for so long. If you got to pick, maybe one word of advice to people listening out there as, a future plant breeder, current plant breeder, or even somebody that's, in their career a few years, what would you give them as some advice?
I think plant breeders tend to be a different group. One of the reasons that I love staying connected with NAPB and the profession is the people. But not everybody's cut out to be a plant breeder, and I think they are a unique profession. So part of my advice is I think some of the experiences I've had where you do sort of these analysis of your personality and how you can apply that to your job and so forth. There's a number of different tools for that, and I've been through a number of them. It seems like plant breeders kind of cluster in one part of the society, and it's a little different than, say, maybe sales or production or others. And So I like that group. They tend to be a little more conservative in many ways, I think. Not all, but as a large majority. I enjoy that. They're doing great work that they were passionate about, and they're changing the world. And it's really a relatively small profession. So I really think the advice I would give is get engaged on a bigger scale. Don't get too crop centric. Don't get too organizational centric. Become part of the community, and that's what NAPB provides, is a professional community. The networking and relationships are far more important today than ever. And I don't think I understood that as a plant breeder. I was committed to corn. I was in the cornfield all the time. I was working buried in data. I was, working with a small group of people because we worked in different ways. We weren't nearly as team oriented as things are in big organizations today. So I think today more than ever, the professional societies serve a huge important role to young aspiring plant breeders. And my advice would be to engage and volunteer and give back from the beginning of your career.
So yeah, get involved in APB, right? That's your,
Why not? Why not?
I mean,
You'll
I think people don't realize how easy it is to get involved with an APB. You know, from the beginning of my school, I was sitting in on committees. I know the grad students is probably one of the only ones that you can't really sit in on just because there's so many positions now in the graduate student working group. There's beyond just the main leadership, chair, vice chair. There's a bunch of other ones, whether you want to get involved with the social media or the webinars. There's a bunch of different positions. But outside of that, because I think that's what students see. But for instance, this education committee, I've been sitting in on it, just sitting in on the meetings the entire time I've been involved in APB, which has been, I don't know, like 6, 7 years, something like that. I'm just sitting out, like you can just reach out, our emails are online, they're on the website. Any other committees, you can reach out and be involved. You don't need to necessarily be elected a certain position, but most of them are just open to any NAPB members. And if you want to be involved and interact with others and and network or have an impact on the organization itself, you can. That's all it takes. So
I think the people that get the most out of it are the people that put the most into it. And you're exactly right, Lance, and you're seeing that yourself. But I think volunteering is something that really adds a dimension to your career. It's very personally rewarding. It really gives you a purpose in a different direction than your normal day job. And to the extent your organizations can support you in it, I think they benefit as well by your involvement. And I think people are starting to see that more and more. And we really have a hard time as plant breeders participating in the annual meetings because sometimes they conflict with our crop responsibilities. And so we're trying in our new strategic plan to figure out ways of engaging more of our membership year round. And also through some of the collaborations that we're having with other organizations, we're starting to think about, well, are there side meetings or joint meetings or things like that that we could implement that would add value and opportunity to be engaged with. A lot of our members are already engaged in the seed trade or the Tri-Society's scientific efforts. And so we have a lot of dual memberships, but how can we leverage those opportunities where people are serving already in those organizations? And I think if you're not just understanding that those organizations exist and how important they are to the fabric of delivery of plant breeding improvements, um, there's just a lot to learn from each other and a lot to help young people learn faster because there's so much to learn and stay on top of.
yeah, absolutely. And so yeah, just be involved as much as possible, and you're gonna learn, right? You're gonna make connections.
Well, and being involved for the long haul, I think we lose a lot of students when they transition into the new careers because it's so hard to get going in a career. And it's easy for employers not to necessarily support your involvement early on. And so individuals have to drive that themselves if they're going to really continue. And they may have to do it without their organization's blessing for a while. But once you're engaged in showing value back to the organization, you may become the one that is sort of a liaison with the professional community in your organization. So I think some of that is working with your upper management, showing them the benefits of you attending meetings or participating in committees, and making sure that it's not a drag on your day job, which is a challenge for plant breeders. But we're doing it and navigating that space pretty well now, and I think because of it, we're growing as an association, and we're really adding value to the whole industry.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, Don. I think this has been a very interesting topic, and I hope more people get involved, more people join NAPB, more people join Borlaug Scholars, and and take part of mentoring. Like I said, you have had such a huge impact on a lot of people out there, and I'm grateful that you're still involved, even though you've been retired. So.
Well, thank you, Lance. It's been a pleasure being a part of this.